There was a time when I believed that the most important moments in a person's life would always announce themselves. I imagined they would arrive with enough force to leave no room for uncertainty. A conversation impossible to forget. A decision that divided life into everything before it and everything after. A realization so unmistakable that the mind could never confuse it with anything ordinary. I don't believe that anymore. The deepest transformations rarely ask for attention. They don't arrive carrying certainty. They don't introduce themselves as turning points. They settle quietly into ordinary days, disguising themselves as moments too small to remember. Most people continue walking without ever realizing that something irreversible has already begun beneath the surface of their awareness. For a long time, I was one of them, not because I wasn't paying attention. If anything, I paid too much attention. The difficulty was never seeing what was there. The difficulty was accepting that something so quiet could carry that much weight. There are certain moments the mind almost refuses to recognize while they are happening. Not because they lack meaning, but because meaning often arrives long after the event itself has passed. Understanding moves differently than experience. Experience happens in an instant. Understanding sometimes spends months finding its way back to that same moment, only to discover that everything changed there without asking permission. I've returned to those moments more times than I can count. Each time they appear almost identical. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. The same ordinary conversations. The same familiar expressions. The same quiet pauses between sentences that most people forget before the day is over, yet something inside them refuses to remain ordinary. I've often wondered why. Perhaps because the most important things we ever learn rarely come through explanation. They arrive through presence. They settle somewhere beneath language, where words lose their authority and perception quietly begins taking over. Language has always fascinated me, but I've never trusted it completely. Words are careful. They can be arranged, corrected, polished until they resemble almost anything we want another person to believe. Presence has no such ability. Presence tells the truth before language has the opportunity to edit it. It speaks through silence, through hesitation, through the almost invisible shift in someone's attention when something meaningful has just been touched. I've spent years noticing those things. Not intentionally. It simply became the way my mind understood people. While others seemed satisfied with explanations, I kept finding myself drawn toward whatever remained unexplained. Not because I distrusted what people said, but because I slowly realized that truth rarely introduces itself through sentences alone. Sometimes it exists in the pause before someone answers. Sometimes it appears in the relief that follows a difficult confession. Sometimes it reveals itself in the strange calm that settles over a conversation after every important word has already been spoken. Those moments always felt more honest than the conversation surrounding them. For the longest time, I assumed everyone noticed them. Eventually, I realized most people didn't. Not because they were incapable of seeing them, but because life teaches us to listen for information instead of understanding. We learn to hear what people mean to communicate, while quietly overlooking everything their presence reveals without intention. That realization changed the way I looked at almost every interaction. A conversation stopped being an exchange of words. It became an unfolding landscape. Every hesitation carried a memory, every certainty concealed an uncertainty, every carefully chosen sentence quietly exposed something the speaker never intended to reveal. The remarkable thing is that none of it required analysis. People reveal themselves naturally, not because they choose to, because authenticity eventually slips through. Every performance, no matter how carefully the performance has been constructed, I began seeing that everywhere, not only in strangers, in friends, in family, even in myself. That last realization unsettled me more than anything else. It's one thing to recognize hidden patterns in other people. It's another to realize your own inner world has been speaking long before you've been willing to listen. The truth is, I didn't recognize that change immediately. If someone had asked me then whether anything inside me had shifted, I probably would have said no. Everything appeared familiar. My routines remained the same. My conversations continued the way they always had. The world outside me offered no obvious sign that anything significant had taken place. Yet something felt quietly different, not different enough to describe, only different enough that I could no longer experience ordinary moments exactly as I had before. That's the strange thing about awareness. It doesn't always expand all at once. Sometimes it grows so gradually that the person changing continues believing they're still the same. Then one ordinary day they notice that the questions occupying their mind no longer resemble the questions they once carried. That realization stayed with me. not because it answered anything, but because it changed the way I searched. For years I believed understanding meant collecting explanations. If I looked long enough, observed carefully enough, remained patient enough, eventually everything would fit into a structure I could completely describe. Now I'm not so sure. Some experiences seem to resist explanation altogether, not because they're irrational, because they're larger than language. The moment we force them into simple definitions, something essential disappears. I've begun wondering whether the deepest truths are never fully spoken. Perhaps they're only recognized. Recognition is a curious experience. It doesn't arrive with surprise. It arrives with familiarity. Not the familiarity of repetition, but the strange feeling that something you've only just discovered has somehow always belonged to you. I've felt that more than once. Each time it happened, I found myself returning to the same question. Why does something entirely new sometimes feel older than memory itself? I never found a satisfying answer. Instead, I found something quieter. I realized the mind isn't always discovering. Sometimes it's remembering, not remembering events. Remembering perspectives that have existed beneath awareness long before consciousness finally catches up to them. That possibility changed everything. It suggested that growth isn't always about becoming someone new. Sometimes it's about removing enough distraction to recognize the person who has been quietly waiting underneath every borrowed expectation. I carried that thought with me longer than I expected. It followed me through conversations that appeared ordinary, through moments that seemed too insignificant to matter, through silences that somehow communicated more than complete discussions ever managed to express. The more I paid attention, the clearer one pattern became. People rarely reveal themselves during the moments they're trying hardest to be understood. They reveal themselves when they stop trying altogether, a brief hesitation, an unfinished sentence, a smile that arrives a fraction too late, eyes that remain somewhere else even while looking directly at you. Tiny moments, almost invisible, yet together they create a portrait far more honest than any explanation ever could. I've never believed that people are dishonest by nature, quite the opposite. I think most people desperately want to be known. They simply fear what complete visibility might require, so they reveal themselves carefully, one small truth today. Another months later, a contradiction quietly forgotten, a certainty that slowly changes without announcement. Piece by piece, they leave themselves scattered across time. Most people collect memories. I found myself collecting patterns, not because I intended to, because once the mind begins recognizing them, pretending not to notice becomes almost impossible. For a long time, I believed that habit isolated me. I assumed it created distance between myself and everyone around me. Now I wonder if the distance came from somewhere else entirely. Perhaps the real distance wasn't between people. Perhaps it existed between what we experience and what we are willing to admit we've already understood. That possibility stayed with me, quietly, patiently. Never demanding attention, only waiting until I became honest enough to stop looking away. And somewhere within that quiet honesty, I realized something I had spent years overlooking. Not every transformation asks you to become someone different. Some simply return you to the parts of yourself that were always there, waiting for the moment you were finally ready to recognize them.